marriage certificate still exists in the Louisiana State Archives, yellowed and brittle, its ink faded to the color of dried blood. It bears the name Jeremiah Aldrich, signed with a flourish of false refinement, and beneath his signature a single word for the bride, Celeste, listed not as wife but as property. The date reads March 4, 1854. On paper, it was a union of man and woman, but in truth, it was the final act in a history of cruelty that had begun 15 years earlier, when Aldrich first arrived in Louisiana with ambition sharper than any blade. Historians who've examined the document note the peculiarity of its language, its phrasing more akin to a bill of sale than a marriage license. The lines that should have read lawful wife instead describe ownership, binding Celeste to Aldrich in perpetuity. It was a grotesque ceremony witnessed only by a local magistrate and 2 overseers, neither of whom would live out the year. Within 9 months, 13 people connected to Willowbrook plantation would die under circumstances so violent and strange that local papers printed only fragments of the truth. Those fragments still survive, locked away in private archives, brief, sanitized reports that speak of mysterious illness, unexplained fires, and disappearances among the staff. What they omit is the whispered rumor that circulated through St. Charles Parish, that the marriage itself was a curse born from betrayal, greed, and the restless ghosts of crimes too dark to remain buried. Before the plantation was a monument to death, it was merely a house, a grand colonial structure rising above the riverbank, its white columns bright against the cane fields. And before Jeremiah Aldrich became a name spoken with fear, he had been nothing more than the son of a failed tobacco farmer from Kentucky, a man driven south by hunger and humiliation. When he arrived in New Orleans in 1839, the city was swelling with money and sin. Cotton and sugar ruled the economy, but the true fortune lay in the slave trade, the unspoken engine that turned the entire South. Among the old Creole families, dealing in human flesh was a business handled behind closed doors. Publicly, they dined, prayed, and danced to European waltzes. Privately, they bartered lives. It was in this world of polite savagery that Aldrich found his purpose. Too poor to buy status but too clever to starve, he learned that in Louisiana, decency was merely a costume, and he wore it better than most. By the early 1840s, whispers of his ruthlessness were already spreading through the city. He knew how to speak like a gentleman, but his eyes told another story, calculating, hungry, untouched by remorse. It was that ambition, cold and absolute, that would lead him from the muddy streets of New Orleans to the blood-soaked soil of Willowbrook plantation. And before his time there was done, the same hunger that built his fortune would devour him entirely. Jeremiah Aldrich did not inherit wealth, but he understood its anatomy better than most who were born into it. In the hierarchy of antebellum Louisiana, fortune was not earned through toil. It was built on bodies, on backs that bent until they broke, and on laws that declared human life a commodity. Aldrich, ever the opportunist, saw in that system both opportunity and immunity. He arrived in New Orleans in the summer of 1839 with $2 in his pocket, a counterfeit smile, and an instinct for corruption that would serve him well. At that time, New Orleans was a city that devoured the weak and rewarded the cruel. The docks stank of sweat, rum, and human despair. Ships came and went daily, bringing not only goods, but also rumors, fortunes, and the raw materials of empire, cotton, sugar, and enslaved flesh. Aldrich began his climb there, among the warehouses along Chupatoulas Street, where men were bought, sold, branded, and shipped upriver as if they were cattle. He started small, as a clerk for a merchant house that dealt in agricultural logistics, a polite phrase masking the reality of human trafficking. It was in that filthy commerce that Aldrich met 2 men who would define his next decade, Marcus Devo and Samuel Rochelle. Devo, the youngest son of a sugar baron whose fortune had withered under bad harvests, was desperate to restore his family's name. Rochelle, a disgraced ship captain who had survived yellow fever and bankruptcy, knew every smuggler's cove from Havana to Biloxi. Together, they formed an enterprise that flourished in shadow, the Delta Trading Company. The company's operations were simple in concept and monstrous in execution. While legitimate traders filed paperwork and paid taxes, Aldrich and his partners dealt in what the law called undocumented property. They bought kidnapped free blacks from bounty hunters, recaptured runaways for a fraction of their value, and most lucratively, smuggled freshly taken captives from Caribbean ports still active in the illegal Atlantic trade. By 1841, the Delta Trading Company was clearing profits that dwarfed the earnings of many established planters. Their warehouse on the city's edge became a sight of quiet horror. Shackled men and women were held there in silence, hidden from public view behind thick walls and falsified ledgers. The partners called it inventory. Aldrich handled the books. Devo managed the plantations that received their shipments. Rochelle oversaw transportation along the river. Between them, they constructed an invisible empire built entirely on stolen lives. The money came fast, so fast that it corrupted even the pretense of friendship between them. Within 2 years, Aldrich had bought fine suits, dined with Creole elites, and acquired a small estate he named Willowbrook. He practiced refinement the way another man might practice deceit, because for him, the two were one and the same. What none of them understood then was that every fortune built in the Delta carried its own curse, a kind of moral rot that began in the hands and worked its way into the soul. And in Aldrich's case, that corruption was not content to fester quietly. It would demand blood before it was through. By the spring of 1842, the Delta Trading Company had become more than a criminal enterprise. It was an unholy brotherhood bound by greed, secrecy, and fear. The partnership between Jeremiah Aldrich, Marcus Devo, and Samuel Rochelle appeared stable from the outside, but beneath the surface, it pulsed with jealousy and suspicion. Each man had entered the venture for different reasons, and each carried private ambitions that would eventually destroy them all. Marcus Devo, young and restless, saw in the company a means to restore his family's fading glory. His father's plantation in St. Charles Parish was drowning in debt, its fields overworked and its enslaved labor force half-starved. To Marcus, money was salvation, an absolution for years of failure. His conscience, once tender, hardened with every shipment they sold. He told himself it was business, nothing more. But when the night came and the river winds carried the cries from the docks, he drank until memory dissolved. Samuel Rochelle was older by 2 decades, his body already marked by the sea. His left hand trembled from an old fever, and his eyes, pale and sunken, had seen storms and mutinies that would break other men. The Delta Company was his second chance. He supplied the routes, the bribes, and the discipline. Rochelle understood risk better than anyone, but he underestimated the kind of danger that wore fine clothes and smiled like a friend. Aldrich was different. To him, the company was never a partnership. It was a means to ascend. He admired neither Devo's desperation nor Rochelle's experience. He merely tolerated them. Behind his polished manners there lurked something colder than ambition. When he looked upon their captives, he saw not lives but numbers, profit margins, yield ratios, costs of transport. He was not cruel for pleasure. He was cruel for efficiency, and that made him far more dangerous. The 3 men met weekly in a rented warehouse on the city's fringe, where they reviewed shipments, forged documents, and divided their profits. Those meetings grew more strained with each passing month. Devo complained of shortages. Rochelle accused him of mishandling deliveries. Aldrich played mediator, soothing tempers while quietly taking notes. He understood that trust, once fractured, could be weaponized. By late 1842, rumors began to circulate among dock workers and river traders about strange goings-on in the Delta warehouse. Men whispered of locked rooms, of cargo unloaded under moonlight, of screams quickly silenced. The New Orleans constables turned a blind eye. Most were bribed and the rest were afraid. But whispers travel faster than evidence, and soon the company's name reached ears in Washington. Federal agents had begun tracing illegal slave routes along the Gulf, and someone had spoken the name Rochelle. When word of the investigation reached them, panic took hold. Rochelle wanted to relocate their operations to Havana until things quieted down. Devo argued for destroying the records and cutting their losses, but Aldrich, ever calm, already had another plan, one that would end with both men dead and every coin of their wealth resting in his hands. The storm that would consume them had already begun to gather, silent and invisible in the heart of New Orleans. The night of June 17, 1843, was thick with the kind of heat that makes men restless and tempers short. Thunder rolled far out over the Gulf, but the air in New Orleans hung still, as if the entire city were holding its breath. In a deserted corner of the docklands stood the Delta Trading Company's warehouse, a rotting structure of timber and iron that smelled of tar, whiskey, and old sweat. Inside, 3 men gathered for what was supposed to be their final meeting. Only one would leave alive. Jeremiah Aldrich arrived first. He came alone, dressed in his usual dark coat, the kind favored by plantation gentry, though his hands still bore the calluses of a man who had once worked the docks himself. In his pocket was a loaded Derringer pistol. In his boot, a skinning knife honed to a surgeon's edge. He poured 3 glasses of whiskey and waited, rehearsing the story he would tell the police. Marcus Devo came next, carrying ledgers and a nervous smile. He was tired, pale from sleepless nights and constant fear that the federal marshals were closing in. Samuel Rochelle arrived last, his limp more pronounced from the damp weather, his sea captain's instincts telling him something was wrong. He paused at the door, scanning the room, but entered anyway. He always finished what he started. The meeting began with the usual formalities, financial updates, talk of creditors, plans for withdrawal. Rochelle suggested transferring their assets to Havana. Devo wanted to burn the records. Aldrich nodded at both, his voice smooth, his tone reasonable. Then he asked where they'd hidden their reserve cash, the emergency fund that represented the company's true wealth. That question changed the air in the room. Rochelle's pale eyes narrowed. Devo shifted in his chair. Rochelle's instincts screamed at him to leave. He began to stand, muttering that they should meet again in daylight. Aldrich knew the moment had come. He drew his pistol from his coat and fired once, the report deafening in the small space. The bullet struck Devo square in the chest, throwing him backward across the table. His glass shattered on the floor, the whiskey mingling with blood. Rochelle moved faster than expected for a man of 53. He overturned the table and lunged with a broken bottle, slashing Aldrich's face from jaw to cheekbone. The pain blinded Aldrich, rage replacing calculation. They fought across the room, crashing into crates, scattering papers, the pistol skittering away into the shadows. Rochelle grabbed for the knife in Aldrich's boot, but the younger man wrenched it free first and drove it into Rochelle's gut. The old sailor grunted, staggered, and fell against a stack of ledgers, blood soaking the parchment. As he bled out, Rochelle gasped his final words through clenched teeth. "My son knows everything." "He'll come for you." Aldrich twisted the blade and whispered, "Let him try." When the city guards arrived hours later, summoned by hired witnesses, they found a scene that told a simple story. A business dispute turned deadly. Aldrich's wounds looked defensive. The money scattered on the floor suggested robbery. The witnesses swore they'd heard fighting. The case was closed before dawn. No one questioned the survivor. In the days following the warehouse murders, Jeremiah Aldrich played the role of the grieving survivor with practiced ease. He attended both funerals dressed in black, his arm bandaged, his cheek stitched into a jagged scar that lent him the look of a man marked by tragedy rather than guilt. He spoke softly, deferentially, thanking the few mourners who came for their prayers and kindness. Behind that mask of sorrow, he was already arranging the transfer of every asset his dead partners had owned. New Orleans in 1843 was a city eager to forget unpleasant things. The police had no appetite for investigating the deaths of 2 businessmen when the surviving partner was a newly wealthy plantation owner who promised to bring trade and employment to the parish. The report listed the incident as a violent dispute between partners. The bodies were buried, the warehouse demolished, and the matter declared closed. Aldrich made sure of it. Within a week, he presented forged documents to several banks showing that both Devo and Rochelle had signed over their business shares to him in the event of their deaths. The signatures were convincing. He'd spent years studying their handwriting. The clerks, eager to please a man of means, asked no questions. Within a month, Aldrich had emptied every account tied to the Delta Trading Company. He moved the funds through intermediaries, converted them into land deeds, and buried the paper trail under a mountain of respectability. His transformation was astonishing. The same man who once slept in a boarding house near the docks now owned one of the finest properties along the Mississippi River. Willowbrook Plantation, 40 miles upriver from New Orleans, became his kingdom, a sprawling estate of cotton fields, slave quarters, and a grand colonial house built to impress the Creole elite. Aldrich hired overseers, bought bloodhounds, and filled his home with imported furniture. He married briefly, a local merchant's daughter who died within the year of fever, leaving him her dowry and a reputation for tragic misfortune. By 1845, he was fully accepted into the upper ranks of Louisiana society. He hosted dinners where politicians and planters discussed the price of cotton and the threat of abolition. His scar, once a mark of suspicion, became a symbol of survival, a story he retold with practiced melancholy, claiming that he still woke some nights hearing his partner's screams. The lie suited the times. Men respected scars. They did not question them. But beneath the veneer of gentility, Willowbrook was a place of quiet horror. Aldrich's cruelty extended far beyond business. He drove his enslaved workers mercilessly, using starvation and torture as discipline. Whispers spread of disappearances, of punishment pits dug in the cane fields, of nights when screams echoed from the main house and no one dared look toward the windows. He believed himself untouchable, clever enough to bury the past forever. What he did not know was that two men were already watching him from the shadows. Philippe Deveau, brother of the murdered Marcus, and Henri Rochelle, son of Samuel Rochelle, had begun their hunt. Their vengeance would not come with bullets or blades. It would come through patience, precision, and the quiet ruin of everything Jeremiah Aldrich had built. By the spring of 1846, two shadows followed Jeremiah Aldrich wherever he went, though he never saw them. Philippe Deveau and Henri Rochelle had been boys when their fathers were killed, but time and hatred had shaped them into something sharper than grief, something closer to destiny. Philippe, now 26, bore little resemblance to his late brother. Where Marcus had been charming and reckless, Philippe was methodical and quiet, a man who believed revenge was a sacred duty. He had spent 4 years abroad, first in Havana, then in Veracruz, learning trade, languages, and the art of deceit. When he returned to Louisiana, he came under the name Philippe Duval, claiming to be a merchant's agent seeking cotton contracts. No one thought to question him. Henri Rochelle was a different creature altogether. His father's death had left him adrift, wandering the river towns as a deckhand, gambler, and thief. But beneath his ruin ran the same cunning that had once made Samuel Rochelle a formidable captain. Henri knew the docks, the smugglers, and every man in New Orleans who could be bought. It was he who discovered that Jeremiah Aldrich, now Colonel Aldrich in social circles, was the same man whose name appeared in the old Delta Company ledgers. Their first meeting since childhood took place in a tavern off Chartres Street. The room smelled of tobacco and stale rum. Henri sat in the corner, his face half hidden by the brim of his hat. Philippe entered, glanced once around the room, and sat opposite him. No greetings were exchanged. Only a folded paper slid across the table, Aldrich's bank records. "We don't rush this," Philippe said softly. "We take everything he stole one piece at a time." Henri smiled, a thin, bitter thing. "And when it's done? Then he'll see what it is to lose everything and still be alive." For the next 2 years, they set their plan in motion. Philippe used his false identity to secure a business arrangement with Aldrich's cotton brokers, gaining access to shipping manifests and correspondence. Henri infiltrated the river crews that transported goods to and from Willowbrook, quietly intercepting letters, altering shipments, and spreading rumors that Aldrich was laundering Confederate bonds through illegal trade. The first blow fell in 1847 when a fire destroyed Aldrich's storage warehouse in Baton Rouge. He believed it to be an accident. It was not. The second came months later when a forged letter reached his creditors claiming Aldrich intended to flee the country. His accounts were frozen overnight. Then came the whispers that the colonel was under investigation for old crimes, that he had once run slave ships under false names. By 1848, Jeremiah Aldrich felt the walls closing in. His overseers deserted him, his servants whispered when he passed, and the planters who had once shaken his hand now crossed the street to avoid him. He began drinking heavily, wandering the fields at night, muttering that he could still hear Marcus Devo's voice in the dark. Philippe watched from afar and waited. He wanted the man broken, not dead. Death was mercy. What none of them knew was that something older than vengeance was beginning to stir at Willowbrook, something born from the blood and fear soaked into its earth. The year was 1848, and summer in St. Landry Parish came heavy as a fever. The air hung thick with the scent of rot and wet earth. At Willowbrook, The fields grew wild and unkempt, the overseers gone, the enslaved workers restless under a master who had lost his mind. Jeremiah Aldrich no longer rode the fields at dawn as he once had. He wandered instead through the swamps at night, a lantern swinging from his trembling hand, drawn by voices only he could hear. They said the colonel spoke to the ground. Some swore they saw him kneel among the cypress trees, whispering into the mud as if bargaining with something that lived beneath it. Others said they found strange symbols carved into the trunks, circles crossed with lines, markings older than any Christian charm. The workers began refusing to enter certain parts of the property after sundown, especially near the hollow behind the old sugar mill. Dogs would not go near it. The hollow had always been there, an ancient sink of black earth where water never settled and sound seemed to die. The Choctaw hunters who once roamed that land had called it Okatashillup, the Lake of Ghosts. Even in daylight, the air above it shimmered strangely, as if the world itself bent. One night in August, a storm rolled in from the Gulf, fierce and sudden. The sky cracked open, spilling rain like judgment. Aldrich's servants found him the next morning at the edge of the hollow, soaked and filthy, clawing at the earth with bare hands. Beneath the churned mud lay something hard, wood, perhaps stone. He ordered them to dig. They refused. He beat one nearly to death and hired laborers from town instead. What they unearthed over the next 3 days was no chest, no relic but the shattered remains of a foundation, charred stones, half-buried timbers, and something older still beneath it, a slab of carved rock covered in strange, spiraling lines that looked alive when the lantern light touched them. Aldrich dismissed the laborers after paying them twice the rate, then returned that night alone. From the window of the slave quarters, one woman swore she saw him kneeling before the stone, his shirt stripped off, his hands bleeding. She said he spoke in tongues, his voice not his own. Another claimed to see a black mist rise from the hollow, twisting like smoke but moving against the wind. After that night, Willowbrook began to change. The crops rotted in their rows, though no blight was found. Rats infested the cellars, milk soured before dawn, and Aldrich himself grew pale and gaunt, his scar turning black at the edges. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and began locking himself in the study for days at a time, muttering that something had answered him. By autumn, even the workers who had endured his cruelty for years fled into the swamps. Only a handful remained, those too frightened or too weak to run. And when the moon was full, they said they could hear a low hum rising from the hollow, like the earth itself was breathing. Henri Rochelle, ever watching, sent word to Philippe. He's unraveling faster than we planned. Philippe's reply was short, almost cold. Let him. The devil collects his own. But what neither man yet understood was that the devil Aldrich had called to Willowbrook did not belong to any scripture. It belonged to the soil, and it was hungry. By the winter of 1848, Willowbrook was no longer merely a ruined plantation. It had become a place people crossed themselves when they passed. The parish roads near it grew over with vines, and the neighboring farmers swore that smoke sometimes rose from its fields without fire, drifting like breath from unseen mouths. Henri Rochelle was the first to see what had become of Jeremiah Aldrich. He came one night under the pretense of collecting a debt, but his true reason was curiosity, the kind that gnaws at a man who has prayed for another's suffering too long. He found the main house nearly empty. The grand parlor where Aldrich once entertained senators was now lined with decaying portraits. Their faces bubbled from damp. The smell of mildew and rot filled the air. Candles burned low in every room, though no one tended them. When Henry called out, his voice echoed strangely, as if the house itself whispered back. He found Aldrich in the study, slumped in a chair beside a fire that had burned to embers. The man who had once carried himself with ruthless precision was unrecognizable. His hair was white at the roots, his eyes sunken and rimmed with red. He clutched a ledger to his chest like scripture. Henri Rochelle, he rasped without looking up. I've been waiting for you. Henri froze. He had not used his family name since the night his father died. Aldrich smiled, a thin, broken thing. The hollow told me you'd come. It tells me everything now. On the desk lay the stone tablet unearthed months earlier, its surface crawling with patterns that seemed to shift like oil in firelight. The air around it pulsed faintly, alive. Henri felt it before he understood it. A vibration in his teeth, a faint hum in his bones. "What have you done?" he whispered. Aldrich's hand trembled over the slab. "You think you came to destroy me, but you only came to feed it. It needed blood, betrayal, hatred, and you brought all three." Henri took a step back. The firelight flickered, dimmed, then flared blue. The shadows in the room lengthened unnaturally, curling toward the tablet. A sound filled the air. Not quite a voice, not quite a wind, but something between the two. It spoke in fragments, syllables that made the walls quiver. Henri stumbled out into the hall, clutching the doorframe. He thought he saw faces in the wallpaper, men screaming soundlessly from beneath the paint. The floorboards creaked and breathed. Somewhere upstairs, a door slammed, though no one was there. When he finally fled the house, the fields were moving. The stalks of cane, long dead and blackened, swayed though the air was still. From the hollow behind the mill, a low hum rose again, deeper than before, rolling through the ground like thunder from beneath the earth. He rode through the night until his horse collapsed 10 miles from town. By morning, his hair had gone gray at the temples. Philippe found him 2 days later, fevered and raving. "It's awake," Henri gasped. The ground he fed it, he opened it. Philippe wanted to believe it was madness. But when he returned to New Orleans, he found reports of men disappearing near Willowbrook, of animals mutilated in the fields, of the river running black for a mile downstream. Whatever Jeremiah Aldrich had awakened, it was spreading, and vengeance, once so simple, had become something far more terrible. When Philippe Deveau returned to St. Landry Parish in February of 1849, the sky above the river was the color of ash. The closer he came to Willowbrook, the quieter the world seemed to grow. No birds, no frogs, no wind, only the sound of his horse's hooves on the frozen mud road. The plantation appeared deserted. Smoke no longer rose from its chimneys. The cane fields, once sprawling and alive, were now brittle and black, bending in the windless air like the bones of dead giants. Philippe dismounted at the front steps, the boards soft beneath his boots, the smell of decay rolling out of the open doorway. Inside, the silence was suffocating. Dust lay thick over everything, tables, portraits, bookshelves, as though the house had been abandoned for years, though it had been only months. In the grand hallway, the mirror glass was cracked and darkened, reflecting not his face but a shadow that seemed to move half a beat slower than he did. He called out Aldrich's name once. The sound came back to him wrong, echoing from somewhere deeper in the house, low and hollow, as if the walls themselves repeated it. In the study, the stone tablet still rested on the desk, glowing faintly beneath a film of dust. Around it, pages of notes lay scattered, Aldrich's handwriting growing more frantic line by line. Words repeated over and over, voice in the ground. Gift beneath the blood, open, open, open. Then Philippe saw the trapdoor. It was half hidden beneath the rug, the edges scratched and splintered as though clawed from below. He hesitated, then lifted it. A cold draft rose from the darkness, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of earth, wet, metallic, and sweet like rotting fruit. He descended the ladder, lantern in hand. The air thickened the deeper he went. At the bottom, he found himself in a tunnel, the walls lined not with stone but with roots, vast, gnarled, pulsing faintly as if carrying blood. They moved when he brushed against them. At the tunnel's end was a chamber, a space that should not have existed beneath a house. The carved slab was there again, now set upright in the dirt, its spirals glowing with a dim living light. And before it knelt Jeremiah Aldrich, or what remained of him. His skin had turned the color of clay. His eyes were gone, replaced by 2 pits of shifting black. He whispered continuously, though his lips barely moved. The same words over and over, in a language that felt older than any Philippe had ever heard. The walls pulsed. When Philippe took a step closer, Aldrich's head turned sharply, too sharply, and though his mouth never moved, a voice filled the chamber, a voice that came from the roots, the soil, the very air. "You followed your hate to the door," it said. "Now open it with me." Philippe raised his pistol and fired. The sound was swallowed instantly, as though the earth itself devoured it. The bullet tore through Aldrich's chest, but no blood came, only a black mist that poured from the wound. coiling upward like smoke from a pyre. The light of the lantern flickered, dimmed, then died. When Philippe stumbled out into the night hours later, his clothes were soaked, though with what he could not say. The house behind him was silent again, but as he mounted his horse, he heard a low whisper rising from the hollow, his brother's voice, calling his name from beneath the ground. He did not look back. Philippe Deveau rode through the pre-dawn hours without rest, the cold mist from the river clinging to his coat like grave soil. He did not stop to sleep, did not stop to eat. Behind him, the silhouette of Willowbrook disappeared into the low gray fog that hung over the bayou. By the time he reached the levee roads that led toward New Orleans, the sky was the color of iron and his lantern had burned out. Something had followed him from that place. He felt it first as a weight behind his thoughts, a pressure, as though the air itself resisted his breath. His reflection in a passing pool looked unfamiliar. The eyes seemed too dark, the mouth too pale. Every hoofbeat echoed wrong, a half step behind, as though another rider shadowed him just beyond sight. When he arrived in the city, the streets were still empty. Vendors hadn't yet set up their stalls along Chartres or Royale, and the morning bells from St. Louis Cathedral rang hollow through the damp air. He went straight to the apartment Henri Rochelle kept above the banking offices near Poydras Street. Henri answered in his nightshirt, startled by Philippe's condition. The younger man's face was drawn, gray beneath the eyes, and his hands trembled as though with fever. His clothes, once elegant, were stiff with dried mud and something darker. Philippe's first words were barely a whisper. "He's not dead." Henri frowned. "What do you mean, not dead?" "The house was abandoned." "Not abandoned," Philippe interrupted. "It's alive. The house, the ground beneath it, they're the same thing." He called something up. It spoke through him. "I saw—" He broke off, running a shaking hand through his hair. Henri led him inside and poured whiskey into a glass. Philippe didn't drink it. He sat by the window instead, staring into the gray street below. "Something has been awakened at Willowbrook," he said finally. "Something old. It used him, Aldrich, as a vessel. It's still there beneath the house, waiting. And it knows our names." Henri wanted to dismiss the words as exhaustion or madness, but even as he tried, he felt an unease creeping into the room. The air smelled faintly of wet earth. A damp stain was spreading along the ceiling, though there had been no rain for days. In the following weeks, Philippe tried to write down everything he'd seen, but the ink on his pages bled each morning as though the words refused to remain fixed. He spoke little, slept less, and began to wander the docks at night, muttering about the soil, about a whisper that came from beneath the river. Henri noticed it too, the strange rot creeping through the lower quarters of the city. Rats washed up along the levees in dozens. Dock workers reported hearing voices from the river mud when the tide receded. The scent of decay clung to everything touched by the Mississippi mist. By March, Philippe had grown deathly pale, the skin beneath his nails darkening to an almost black hue. "It's spreading," he said one evening, his voice barely human. "Whatever Aldrich brought forth, it's moved into the water, into the blood of this city." Henri didn't believe him until the night the river turned red. The fishermen who worked the southern wharves found their nets stained and their catch rotted before dawn. The newspapers called it an algal phenomenon, but those who saw it with their own eyes said the water looked thick, like blood. And on the following morning, Henri found Philippe's rooms empty, his papers scattered, his chair overturned, the window wide open though the latch was locked from within. Only one thing remained on the desk, the cracked stone tablet from Willowbrook, wrapped in a stained piece of cloth. Its surface was cold to the touch, and beneath it, scrawled in Philippe's unsteady hand, were the words, "He's beneath the city now." The ground is listening. The spring of 1849 brought no renewal to New Orleans. Rain came heavy and constant, turning the streets into brown rivers that carried rot from the levees into the city's heart. The air itself seemed ill, thick with a dampness that stung the lungs and left a sour taste on the tongue. Henri Rochelle felt it before he could name it. The city was sick. Everywhere he went, he found signs of infection. The foundations of houses along the lower wards began to sink into the earth, as though the soil had softened beneath them. The water that rose through the cobblestones was black, slick, and foul-smelling. Even the great oaks that lined Esplanade Avenue began to lean unnaturally, their roots pushing upward like fingers clawing toward the surface. Henri knew the symptoms because he had seen them before, at Willowbrook. He began his investigation quietly, working by candlelight long after the bank closed each evening. Philippe's disappearance had left a void in him, one that only deepened as he studied the note left behind. The handwriting was unmistakable, but the words, they did not feel entirely human. Each letter seemed pressed into the paper rather than written, as though carved by something that had learned to mimic a man's hand. The tablet sat on the desk before him, still wrapped in the blood-stained cloth. Despite every instinct to destroy it, Henri could not bring himself to do so. The surface markings shifted slightly when viewed from different angles, like a reflection in moving water. Sometimes, when the candles guttered low, he could swear he heard a soft whisper coming from within the stone, a sound like wind moving through deep tunnels. He kept a detailed ledger of the city's decay. His entries grew more frantic as the pattern emerged. Every neighborhood along the river had begun to sink at roughly the same rate. Residents complained of hearing movement beneath their floors, like something burrowing through the mud. More than once, Henri overheard talk of missing livestock, and in one case, a child taken from a garden whose soil had been freshly overturned. He brought his findings to the city authorities, but they dismissed him as a superstitious clerk. The floodplain's shifting, they said. You bankers see numbers where others see rain. But Henri knew this wasn't rain. This was consequence. At night, he dreamt of Philippe, standing knee-deep in the river, eyes black as pitch, whispering in a voice that wasn't his own. He's beneath the city, the dream figure said again and again, and he's listening through the water. Unable to rest, Henri began mapping the spread of the subsidence. The deeper he studied, the clearer the shape became, a spiral pattern, centered not on the French Quarter or the port, but on a point upriver, Willowbrook Plantation. The thing buried beneath the house was bleeding through the land itself, using the river's veins to carry its corruption downstream. By June, Henri had made his decision. He gathered what remained of his savings, purchased a flatboat, and loaded it with oil, salt, and gunpowder, supplies not for trade but for destruction. He told no one of his plans. On the night he departed, the rain ceased for the first time in weeks. The river lay still, reflecting the moon in a perfect silver line. Yet as he poled his way into the current, he saw ripples breaking that mirrored surface. Ripples that came not from fish or wind, but from something moving just below, keeping pace with his boat. He whispered a prayer he didn't believe in anymore, gripping the oar until his knuckles bled. If you took Philippe, he said softly, then you'll take me too. But you won't take this city. Behind him, the skyline of New Orleans faded into the fog. Ahead, the darkness of the bayou swallowed everything whole, and from somewhere beneath the water came the sound of breathing. The journey upriver took Henri Rochelle 6 days. On the morning of the 7th, the fog lifted just enough to reveal the shape of Willowbrook, rising from the swamp like a wounded animal that refused to die. The grand plantation house still stood, though its walls leaned inward and the roof sagged where rot had eaten through the beams. Moss hung from the veranda in curtains, and the once white columns were streaked with black veins of moisture. Henri tied his boat to a half-submerged post and stepped onto the mud. The air was heavy with the same smell Philippe had described, the copper-sweet scent of decay that was not quite death but something older, hungrier. As he approached, the ground gave slightly beneath his boots, soft as flesh. Inside, the house had not changed. Every piece of furniture remained where it had stood years before, though all were dusted with ash. The portraits on the walls had darkened, faces melting into the shadows, and the mirrors reflected nothing at all. The silence was thick enough to press against his ears. He carried with him the stone tablet wrapped in oilcloth and a satchel of salt and powder. His plan was simple: destroy what Philippe had found, burn whatever lay beneath the house, and collapse the tunnels before the curse spread further. He had told himself this was duty, but as he crossed the threshold of Aldrich's old study, he knew it was something else. It was revenge. The desk still held the same scattered papers, only now the ink had run until the words resembled dark roots branching across the page. On the far wall, A narrow slit of light marked the edge of the trapdoor Philippe had described. Henri knelt, brushed away the dust, and pulled it open. A cold breath rose from below, wet, deep, endless. He lit a lantern and descended. The steps creaked, but held. The tunnel walls were just as Philippe had said, roots twisting through the soil like veins, pulsing faintly with light that came from nowhere. The deeper he went, the louder the sound grew, a rhythm like a slow heartbeat, measured and patient. The chamber opened suddenly before him. The stone slab stood upright at its center, its spirals glowing a dull red, as though lit from within. The air trembled with a low hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Then he saw the figure. Jeremiah Aldrich knelt before the slab, motionless. His skin had hardened to a gray crust, his body half fused with the roots that crawled from the floor and into his flesh. His head was bowed, yet when Henri stepped closer, the eyes snapped open, black, bottomless. "You came back," the voice said, though the lips did not move. "He told me you would." Henri raised the lantern. "Where is Philippe?" Aldrich smiled. It was a slow, cracking gesture, splitting his face down the center. "He's listening." "He's part of it now. So will you be." The hum deepened. The slab spirals began to turn, grinding the earth itself. Henri tore open his satchel, scattering salt across the floor, then smashed the lantern at his feet. The flames caught instantly, running along the tunnel walls like veins of fire. Aldrich screamed, a sound not of pain, but of rage. The roots writhed, striking out like snakes. Henri lunged forward, seizing the stone tablet, and hurled it against the glowing slab. Both shattered in a burst of red light and black smoke. The chamber shook violently. Cracks split the ceiling. Mud and fire poured together. As Henri turned toward the ladder, the ground collapsed beneath him, and he felt himself falling into darkness that had no bottom. When he opened his eyes again, he was outside. The house was burning, flames reaching high into the night, reflected in the still river beyond. The fire made no sound, no crackle, no roar, only a deep, steady pulse that matched the rhythm of his racing heart. He staggered toward the levee, coughing through the smoke. Behind him, Willowbrook sank slowly into the earth, its roof folding inward, its walls consumed by fire. The last thing he saw before he collapsed was the reflection of the flames rippling across the water, spreading outward like veins through the river. The curse was not gone. It was moving. Henri awoke 3 days later in a fishing hut along the Atchafalaya. A Creole trapper had dragged him from the riverbank, half dead and covered in ash. His body burned with fever, and his hands were blistered where he'd touched the cursed stone. When he tried to speak, his tongue felt thick, as though he had swallowed mud. Outside, the world was wrong. The swamp no longer smelled of life, not of moss, fish, or rain. It reeked of iron, of something bleeding beneath the water. The trapper told him strange things had been happening since the night of the fire. The river ran slower, darker. Animals refused to drink from it. Fish surfaced belly up, their eyes pale and empty. When Henri staggered to the levee, he saw it for himself. The river's surface pulsed faintly, as though something beneath it was breathing. He followed the current downstream for miles. At every bend, the signs grew worse. Cypress roots slick with a black sheen, trees bowed toward the water as if in prayer. He found an entire village abandoned, doors swinging open, tables still set for supper. The air hung heavy with the same faint hum that had haunted the tunnels. It came from the river now, low and rhythmic, like a vast heart beating beneath the mud. At night, Henri dreamed of Aldrich. He saw him kneeling in the flooded ruin of Willowbrook, whispering to the river in a language older than speech. When Henri woke, the dream did not fade. He would still hear the whispers, 1,000 murmuring voices echoing from the banks. By the 5th night, he reached a stretch of the river where the trees had died in a perfect circle. The ground was soft, trembling slightly. He realized the waterline had risen nearly a foot since morning, yet there had been no rain. Something beneath the silt was pushing upward, filling the river from below. He remembered Philippe's warning. The land is eating itself. Henri knelt and dipped his hand into the current. The water was warm, almost hot. When he pulled his hand back, black residue clung to his skin, pulsing faintly before sinking into his pores. A burning sensation crawled up his arm. He tried to scrape it off, but it had already vanished beneath the flesh. That night, The trapper found him standing barefoot in the shallows, whispering. Henri did not remember speaking, but the man swore he had been repeating the same words over and over. He's still in the earth. He never left. The next morning the trapper was gone. Henri followed his footprints until they vanished at the water's edge. There in the mud were fresh indentations, not of feet, but of hands, as though something had crawled from the river and dragged the man back in. Henri fled. For days he traveled by foot, through reeds and rain, until he reached the outskirts of Baton Rouge. The fever worsened, but so did something else. He could hear the river. Even from miles away, it called to him. A deep, patient voice, promising peace if he would only return. On the evening of July 9th, 1856, Henri Rochelle disappeared from his lodgings. The next morning his clothes were found folded on the levee. His footprints led into the water and stopped. The same day, steamboat pilots reported strange behavior in the current. The Mississippi slowed, eddied, then rose 2 feet higher than its banks before returning to normal. The following week, 3 plantations along the river collapsed into sinkholes overnight. Locals said it was the work of the floodplain, nature reclaiming what man had stolen. But the old Cajuns whispered a different tale, that the river had finally found a voice, and it was hungry. In the summer of 1891, more than 3 decades after the burning of Willowbrook, a team of surveyors was sent upriver to chart a new railway line through the old plantation country south of Baton Rouge. They were led by Thomas Grady, a civil engineer from St. Louis who had no patience for superstition and less for the whispered folklore of Cajun fishermen. But within a week of their arrival, even the most practical men began to sense something wrong with the land. The soil itself seemed alive, soft and trembling beneath their boots, as though the ground resented their weight. Their instruments malfunctioned, compasses spun without reason, and at night, when the air cooled and the frogs fell silent, they heard what they first mistook for thunder, a low, slow pulse that came not from the sky, but from beneath the mud. Locals refused to camp near the site. They warned Grady that he was trespassing on terre brûlée, the burned earth. An old fisherman told him a story of a house that sank in one night and a river that began to breathe afterward. Grady laughed, calling it swamp talk, and pressed on. On the 10th day, his men unearthed the first stones. Half buried in the muck, they found the remains of a foundation, blackened brick and scorched beams, warped like melted iron. Beneath it lay a stone tablet, fractured clean down the center, its surface carved with symbols none of them recognized. The younger surveyors joked that they'd discovered the Devil's Milepost. Grady ordered it packed into a crate for shipment to New Orleans. That night, the river rose without warning. No rain had fallen for weeks, yet the current swelled, overflowing the banks. The men awoke to water lapping at their tents. Their horses screamed and broke loose, vanishing into the trees. When dawn came, half the camp was gone, washed away or sunken beneath the mud. Grady and 2 others remained. They found the crate containing the stone tablet cracked open. Inside, the pieces were gone. The earth around the hole was smooth, as if something had slid out during the night. The men tried to leave, but the swamp had changed. The landmarks were gone, the trees rearranged, their roots twisting across the trail like ribs from a buried giant. The air was thick with a wet metallic scent, blood, or something close to it. They came upon what they thought was a tree trunk jutting from the water, but when Grady touched it, the surface gave beneath his hand, skin, not bark. He stepped back in horror as the trunk shuddered, revealing the faint outline of a face beneath layers of dark, translucent film. Eyes opened within it, black and unblinking. The other men fled. Grady stumbled after them, the mud sucking at his boots. Behind him came a faint sloshing, rhythmic and steady, like breath drawn through water. When he looked back, the riverbank was smooth again. Whatever he had seen was gone. Days later, a rescue party found him wandering near Plaquemine, half mad and covered in mud that pulsed faintly under his skin. He lived long enough to speak only one sentence before collapsing. "It's not buried. It's waiting." The railway project was abandoned. The government sealed off the area, citing geological instability. The locals didn't argue. To this day, they say that when the fog rolls low across that stretch of the Atchafalaya, You can still hear the faint, slow rhythm of something breathing beneath the river, and if you listen too long, it starts to match your heartbeat. In 1932, amid the Great Depression, a young historian named Clara Beaumont arrived in Baton Rouge to catalog the lost estates of the lower Mississippi. Her work was meant to be academic, a quiet government assignment for the Works Progress Administration. But what she found instead was the final chapter of a story the state had tried for decades to forget. In the parish records, she discovered a name that appeared again and again, scratched out each time by different hands: Willowbrook. No deeds, no maps, no ownership history survived. Yet in every mention there was an attached notation. See also Rochelle Henry, deceased, 1856. That name sent her downriver. Local archives held nothing. The clergy denied knowing it. But one old archivist at the St. Martinville courthouse, a man near blind with age, told her softly, "You'll find Willowbrook where the river don't flow right." He handed her a crumbling ledger bound in black leather, its title half burned away. Inside were the final writings of Father Mathurin, a priest who had ministered to the Atchafalaya region until his disappearance in 1857. His notes described unnatural warmth rising from the water, livestock refusing to drink, and dreams of faces beneath the river's skin. The last entry, dated July 10, 1856, read simply, "The river speaks the name Rochelle." Clara followed the clue to the place the old maps labeled Terre Brûlée. The land was nearly impassable, tangled cypress, stagnant pools, the heavy silence of a world half drowned. Yet as she pressed on, the ground beneath her boots began to feel oddly rhythmic. She knelt and realized the soil trembled faintly with each beat, like the pulse of a sleeping creature. When she reached the water's edge, she saw ruins beneath the surface, not rocks, but the outlines of a structure, columns, brick, a staircase descending into silt, the remnants of Willowbrook. Clara set up camp nearby and spent the night transcribing what she could see. But as dusk settled, the air thickened, and a low hum began, so deep she felt it in her bones. Her lantern flickered. The river's surface rippled outward, though there was no wind. Then, rising slowly through the murk, came a shape. A man's face, eyes closed, mouth slightly open as though whispering beneath the current. She stumbled backward, her journal falling into the mud. When she retrieved it, wet fingerprints had smeared across the page, long, thin, and too deep to belong to any living hand. At dawn, the hum ceased. The water lay still again. Clara packed what remained of her notes and fled to New Orleans. There she presented her findings to the State Historical Board, which dismissed them as hallucinations brought on by swamp gas exposure. But before she left Louisiana, she deposited her journal in the archives of Tulane University, marked simply, "The Rochelle Account, Willowbrook Site, 1856-1932. The last page bears her handwriting, shaky and rushed. The curse was never of the land, it was of the blood. The river is not haunted, it is fed." Clara Beaumont vanished 3 weeks later while traveling upriver toward Shreveport. Her steamer was found adrift, all passengers accounted for, except her. In her empty cabin, investigators found a single item floating in a basin of dark water, a leather-bound notebook, edges burned. Its pages soaked but legible. The ink on the final line had not yet dried. "It's awake again,"